Hi, everybody. It's Miss O'Connell. I hope you are all doing well. I am here to deliver the last couple of slides of our Vietnam chapter, so hopefully you've been keeping up with those. I'm also going to post the quiz tonight, so you'll have a couple of days to do that. Give you a little break, and then I'm going to get into chapter 24, which is all about Nixon and Watergate and why he becomes the only president to resign. So if you last remember, we had talked about how the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was repealed, and it made sure that Congress would have more power than the president because the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution had taken power away from the president. So when we last talked, we had talked about all the troubles at home, the Kent State shooting, the Jackson State shooting, the Pentagon Papers, basically that the government had been lying to the American people. So the United States is going to continue with their Vietnamization. 1972 rolls around. Nixon was having re-election, and he had promised to get the U.S. out of Vietnam. And here we were 4 years later, and we weren't out yet. So he really wanted to leave the war behind in 1972. So Kissinger had high hopes that peace was at hand. However, there's going to be these peace talks that fall through because North Vietnam did not want to leave South Vietnam. They wanted to continue to fight and to take that over and to make it into one Vietnam that was communist. So peace talks fall through on there. So then we're going to have the Christmas bombings, which was kind of the U.S.'s last attempt to kind of stifle some type of peace agreement. So it was 11 straight days of bombing of North Vietnamese targets. North Vietnam and the U.S. resumed negotiations, but on January 27th, 1973, the war ends. So the conditions of the war ending, basically, the United States said, we're done. All right. So number one, the U.S. would withdraw their troops. And number two, both sides would exchange prisoners of war. So no more U.S. troops, and any prisoners of war that we had, they would be exchanged and returned home. So after the U.S. leaves Vietnam in January of 1975, Cambodia is going to come under the control of a man by the name of Pol Pot, this looker right here. And he was the leader of the Khmer Rouge, which was a communist group. So now North Vietnam is communist, and Vietnam and Cambodia is communist. Okay, and South Vietnam, the weaker nation, is going to be democratic. So in March of 1975, and what you have to know about Pol Pot is that he was ruthless, responsible for the murder of thousands of individuals who would not succumb to what he was trying to implement. So in March of 75, North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam. The U.S. response, Gerald Ford, who's going to be president after Nixon, is going to ask Congress for funds to aid South Vietnam, but Congress is going to refuse. They said, we're not getting into this again. It's just, we're not going to dig a deeper hole than we already have. April 30th of 1975, North Vietnam is going to capture Saigon, which is the capital of South Vietnam, and they are also going to control the neighboring country of Laos. So they're going to rename Saigon Ho Chi Minh City, and the U.S. basically watched the domino effect play out. One country fell to communism, North Vietnam. Then Cambodia fell to communism. Then South Vietnam is going to fall to communism. So when we look at what Vietnam looks like today, there is one Vietnam, and it is a communist nation. Okay, one Vietnam, communist nation. No more North and South Vietnam, only one. So the legacy of Vietnam: the U.S. spent $173 billion, 58,000 Americans died, and 300,000 were injured. And as far as the Vietnamese were concerned, about 1 million North and South Vietnamese died, along with many more civilians. Can't forget My Lai, where 500 men, women, and children were slaughtered. And when soldiers came home, they really had a hard time readjusting to American life. This is where we really see PTSD start to come into play, remembering things that had been done, that soldiers did to individuals that they lived through, that they saw. And usually, during World War I and World War II, soldiers came home to, parades and cheering, and a lot of Vietnam veterans were booed and spit on, and they thought they had a choice in fighting the war, when in reality they didn't. They were just drafted, and they went to fight for their country as their country had told them to do. So they didn't get the warm welcome that a lot of other individuals had gotten. POWs, prisoners of war. John McCain, who ran for president, was probably the most known prisoner of war from Vietnam. He was a senator from Arizona. He recently died within the last couple of years of a brain tumor. And he was noted for surviving and persevering and going on. But you see a lot of PTSD in this instance. Also a lot of MIAs, missing in actions, people who were never found. So the impact of the Vietnam War on the United States, first of all, the War Powers Act is going to set limits on executive power and how much power the president has. The president has to inform Congress of commitment of troops that he plans to send abroad within 48 hours, and he had to withdraw those troops within 60 to 90 days. If he didn't, Congress had to approve of that troop commitment. So, Johnson had just sent troops, and Congress wanted to make sure that the president wouldn't be able to do that. Also, the war shook the nation's confidence, and it made some people begin to question what we were doing and what our foreign policy stance was. And it also, this is probably the biggest one, is that increased American cynicism about our government. Are our nation's leaders lying? You think about the times of Washington, Adams, and Jefferson. You didn't think that, they were trusted. They were, they wouldn't lie to the American people. But I think now in the modern presidency, we have this idea of what's the truth versus what's reality. And that really all starts to come about at the Vietnam time. So how do we remember Vietnam? Well, a lot of people demanded that a Vietnam War memorial be made. And so there was a contest for the design of the Vietnam War Memorial, and it was won by a girl, a 21-year-old student from Yale. Her name was Maya Lin, and she actually was from Athens, Ohio. And her design was a wall of black granite so that it could be reflective with the sun and everything. And it had the names of all of those individuals who had served in Vietnam. And it was also the first memorial to honor women and nurses. If you go to Washington, D.C., you can see the memorial, and you can see some statues of nurses tending to the wounded. So what you can see are there are names on the wall. If it has a diamond next to the name, that means that person was killed in action. If it has a cross, it means that someone is missing in action or a prisoner of war. If they have a plus sign with a circle, that is someone who was missing in action but was found alive, and no such cases exist. So you wouldn't see a plus sign with a circle because that has not happened. And then when someone who was an MIA or a POW is found but not alive, they can easily change that cross into a diamond. Okay, so you'll see a lot of those in instance. A lot of times, if you go to Washington D.C. and see the memorial, you'll see people shading over names of remembrances. You'll see people put flowers. And what was really interesting is this was a privately funded memorial by a Vietnam Veterans Memorial Group, because the U.S. government didn't really want to touch it because there was such a stain on Vietnam and what had happened there. So the U.S. government did not want to fund it, did not want to fund the war memorial. So it was all done with private donations. Okay, so that is the end of our presentation. I hope you learned something from this, okay? I am going to put your quiz up on Google Classroom. You'll have, I think, till Tuesday to complete that. So make sure you're listening to these lectures. I made a YouTube channel just for you guys. Everyone should be able to access it. If you have questions, shoot me a line, drop me a text, do whatever you need to do. Email me. I'm always here to help you out when needed. Again, I miss you guys all so much. I hope you're doing well, and I will talk to you soon.